welcome to tonight's webinar. Let me clear my screen a little bit here. And I can't see, there we go. All right. So we have a bunch of people joining on Instagram. So welcome to everyone there. And tonight we're going to, by the way, since we have a bunch of people on Instagram, my name is Dr. Jonathan Carp. I am president and founder of Miracle Noodle. And tonight, every week, actually, I hold a class. And tonight, we're actually going to be talking about metabolic flexibility and why that's such an important thing for you to understand essentially the entire metabolism of your body and how that metabolism is contributing to a whole host of medical problems. So right now, we're on Zoom. We have a Zoom webinar going, and we also have our Instagram Live. On Zoom, I'll be sharing a what's called a mind map. So let me pull that up on the screen, and we will get started. Okay, let's check that out. And I'm going to blow this up a little bit. And we're going to close a couple windows here. And you should be able to, on Zoom, see the mind map. We have a really good showing tonight. Appreciate everyone who is joining. And we also have a good crowd on Instagram. So, metabolic flexibility. My goal for tonight's lecture is, by the end of this lecture, for you to understand different states of metabolism in your body and how that impacts your actual decisions on how you are going to choose what type of eating that you do, whether that is related to fasting or how it is impacted by exercise. By the end of the lecture, you'll understand all this so that you can make the right decisions for your health. For people who are on Instagram, definitely, if you have a question, let me know. Same thing on Zoom. If you have any questions, also let me know, and I'll see that, and any questions you have, we'll get started. So what is metabolic flexibility? Well, it basically, just to sum it up, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail, metabolic flexibility is basically the ability, simply stated, for your body to switch between using glucose or blood sugar and having the ability to use fat. And the reason that this is important is because it is almost like when you think of yourself as being fit, you know, your muscles can handle different things and your cardiovascular system can handle different things, increased capacity, increased strength. Well, the same thing goes with your metabolism, because when your metabolism isn't working all that great, then you're stuck in maybe having too much glucose metabolism, too much blood sugar, and your ability to not be able to switch to burning fat is going to impair your ability to actually do things like lose weight and to put your body into a state that is consistent with longevity and better health and being slimmer. So that's why this is an important thing for us to discuss. When it is described in the medical literature, it's basically described as an ability of an organism to respond or adapt according to changes in metabolic or energy demand. So the ability for you to adapt to things based on what kind of energy your body is taking in. Now, we're going to refine this as the lecture goes on, but essentially, it's going to be between burning fat and burning sugar. The more common concept of metabolic flexibility, as we discussed, is the context of fuel selection, transitioning from going from a fasted state to a fed state. And what is really going on in your body when you're switching between those two things? That is an indicator of your metabolic flexibility. It was basically first described by a duo by the name of Kelly and Mandarino, and they basically reconsidered some of these concepts because of what's seen in type 2 diabetes and obesity. And as they said, in which during skeletal muscle has elevated glucose oxidation using glucose and reciprocal or reduced fatty acid oxidation, which basically means your ability to break down fat into fatty acids, which can then be used. So breaking down fat. So again, to sort of summarize that up, we're essentially talking about the ability of your body to switch between burning sugar and burning fat. And in conditions like type 2 diabetes, as well as obesity, this is impaired. And we'll get into that as we go through the lecture and how we can reclaim the ability to switch back and forth, which is going to be really a positive thing for your overall health. Now, I thought about where to put this in tonight's lecture, which is basically a summary of fuel metabolism. And with fuel metabolism, meaning what happens during sleep, what happens during fasting, what happens during exercise, and what happens during eating. And basically, we'll go through each one of these. And then when you get through this part of the lecture, you're going to understand what's going on in your body during these states. And then you'll be able to apply them and understand what's coming after that, which is basically what happens when we change our diet. What happens when we do fasting? What are the different types of fasting? How are they impacting our metabolic flexibility? Which one should we pick? What does exercise do? And all these different things you're going to understand after this section. So I'm going to open these up. It's going to look complicated. And for people on Instagram, you can't see it, but we'll go through it. We'll go through it step by step. Okay, so let's go through each of these one by one. Now we have essentially 5 different things here. So we have fatty acid oxidation, which is basically you're breaking down of fat. You have use of glucose. And now there's something called glycogen. So let's talk a little bit about what glycogen is and why it's important in the body. So glycogen is basically when you're eating and your body has a capability of storing sugar for use in your muscles as well as just energy. And some of the glycogen is stored in your muscles, and a great majority of it is actually stored in your liver. And this is it's like a quick reservoir for maintaining your blood sugar, it breaks down into blood sugar. So when you're storing glycogen, you are essentially storing a reserve of energy that's in the form of sugar, of blood glucose. Now, your body obviously can also store fat, and it can store fat in the form of fat, essentially. And so when you have lipolysis, you're actually breaking down fat. And fatty acid storage, of course, is you're essentially storing it. So during sleep, it makes sense that during sleep, you are almost essentially you are, and this is ideally in sleep, meaning if your body is working properly, then you're going to have increased fatty acid oxidation because your body is in a fasted state. And you're going to see similarities between the sleep state and the fasting state. Now, what's amazing about this and what should sort of be front of mind is that if you just ate before you went to sleep, you're actually going to be interfering with this natural process, because if your body is still digesting, then it is not going to be able to shift into the proper state when it's in the sleep state, which is basically a fasted state. And this is one of these things that when you start to see what's supposed to happen during sleep and what's supposed to happen during eating, and you mix the two, you start to get a very concrete understanding of the rhythms of your body. That's what makes sort of this section, I think, of the lecture so important. In fact, I often think that when you get a sort of a granular understanding of this particular thing that we're talking about, what's happening in each one of these states, it is like you get it, and then you realize when you're eating really late at night and you're about to go to sleep, you realize, again, in a kind of concrete, granular way, why you really need to be careful not to do that. So we get increased fatty acid oxidation, okay, which makes sense. because you're in a fasted state, your body is basically going to start switching to using fatty acids for energy, decreased glucose use, decreased glycogen storage, because you're not eating, you're not storing sugar, increased lipolysis, and it decreased fatty acid storage. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, essentially, you're getting basically the same thing with fasting. So you're getting increased fatty acid oxidation, of course, a whole lot more than you would get in sleep. Increased glucose, okay, you get increased glucose oxidation. So that's the difference, because you're in an excessive fasted state. So you're going to use up as much of the sugar as you possibly can. What's left, certainly decreased glycogen and increased lipolysis, and of course, decreased fatty acid oxidation. So I hope you're seeing that these do, I hope they do sort of make sense to you when you think about these things. Now, what happens during exercise? So let's close this down just so you can see the screen a little bit better. And I see a bunch of other people who have come on, so welcome. Now, with exercise, okay, you're getting increased fatty acid oxidation. In other words, you are basically using you are in a state where you need as much energy as possible. So you are going to use fatty acids for energy. You're also going to use sugar, glucose, for energy. Your glycogen storage is going to be decreased because you are using it for quick burst of energy. Now, there are athletes out there who are on the ketogenic diet and they have essentially no glycogen. And the reason that they're able to exercise is because their fatty acid oxidation has been so optimized and they have lipolysis, their fat is being broken down, that you can sustain energy. And so you have a whole generation of ketogenic athletes. And they're basically doing that based on this increased fatty acid oxidation and this increased lipolysis. Of course, there's decreased fatty acid storage. So their ability to actually lay down fat is during exercise obviously decreased, which makes intuitive sense, I would hope. So I hope you understand the context of what we're talking about here. So this is what's going on with exercise. Now, let's talk about what happens with eating. So you're going to get decreased fatty acid oxidation. You're going to get increased glucose oxidation and a major increase in glycogen storage, obviously. So the key here to understand is when you understand all these different aspects, you see that you need to be able to switch between all of these different states. And each state is slightly unique. And if you are overlapping these things, then there obviously is a problem. And maybe if you think about it, just sort of occurred to me that, you know how your mother told you not to exercise right after you ate? Well, it kind of makes sense. And the reason it makes sense is because each one of these states is its own unique set of metabolic parameters, its own set of metabolism that is unique to it. And if you're not paying attention to the uniqueness of it, you need to realize, again, there's a science that's coming out day by day that is basically telling us that the body is going through all these different cycles. And we can just intuitively understand the fact that we have different cycles, that we have, sleep, and we have activity, we have rest. But when you look and you zoom in on it even more, you start to realize that each one of these states is detailed in its characteristic. Each of these has its own kind of fingerprint that makes it unique. With the sleep and the fasting and the exercise, each one of these things. So they need to be kept in their own place, so to speak. And each of these have to be respected. Just doing a time check here. Okay. Now that we sort of understand these states, if anyone has any questions on them, please do let me know. Again, just to review briefly, oxidizing fats is basically your mitochondria, the powerhouse of your cell, that's basically facilitating the use of fatty acids to generate energy. And then using a decreased glucose, decreased glycogen storage, so the storage capacity of glucose, increased lipolysis, breaking down fat, and decreased fatty acid storage, or decreased fat storage. Okay, all right, so let's jump into methods of achieving metabolic flexibility. And one of them we just basically spoke about, which is respecting metabolic cycles. But let's get into a whole bunch of them. Now, obviously, going in and out of these in the proper way is essentially going to be helpful to maintaining metabolic flexibility. And so first we'll start with fasting. Now, the reason why fasting is going to achieve help you achieve metabolic flexibility is precisely because you are switching into a different state of metabolism. And presumably, of course, you're going to be cycling in and out of fasting. You can't obviously permanently fast. We will talk about the fact that there is a diet called the Calorie Restriction diet, where people eat a very, very low calorie diet. And they do that mainly for the purposes of longevity. And those people are obviously do have metabolic flexibility. Their metabolism becomes very, very efficient. But we're speaking about fasting in the sense of going in and out of fasting. So let's talk a little bit about fasting. So the first type of fasting, there's several types of fasting. First type of fasting we'll talk about is time-restricted feeding. And this is, some people call this intermittent fasting. Generally speaking, in the medical literature, time-restricted feeding basically means where you're basically narrowing the window of eating or extending the number of hours that you don't eat. And most of the studies show that the minimum amount of time between the last meal of the day and the first meal of the day has to be around 13 hours for you to be able to get the benefits of some kind of fasting. So that's not so difficult. You know, that's stopping eating at, say, 7 o'clock and then eating the next day at 8 a.m. And if you do that, you're going to see benefits. And those benefits include having some kind of metabolic flexibility, meaning your body is now able to shift between, presumably shift, hopefully shift between burning sugar and burning fat, or going slightly into ketosis, or increasing lipolysis, like we spoke about before. And you can try to extend that to 14, 15, 16 hours. There's some people who do what's called a 1 meal a day diet. Not necessarily recommending that, but if you could just start at 13 hours, then you are essentially respecting those boundaries, those cycles that we were talking about just a second ago, respecting the boundaries of the fact that your body has these cycles, that you don't want to mix the sleep. You don't want to mix. We all know now that there's a fingerprint for each one of sleeping, fasting, exercising, and eating. We don't want these to mix. And the way you really reinforce the fasting, or even really sort of the sleep state, into what it's supposed to be doing, is you stop eating a few hours before you go to sleep, and maybe an hour or two after you wake up, and you extend that. For people who are having trouble with metabolic flexibility, this time-restricted feeding can really help people out. You know, there are a lot of people out there that have permanently elevated insulin levels. And when insulin levels are very high, it prevents your body from turning on lipolysis or breaking down fat. And the causes of having high insulin, unfortunately for a lot of people, is eating a lot of animal protein and a lot of sugar. We'll get into that a little bit later. Now, intermittent fasting is, in the medical literature, is generally considered to be like 1 or 2 or 3 days of water-only fasting. So water-only fasting obviously carries its risks. One, if you're on diabetes medicines or blood pressure medications, it's not something that you should do without telling your doctor. But fasting 1 day a week is something that is very, very, can be very, very beneficial. I wouldn't do more than a day or two on your own, as I said, especially if you're on diabetes medicine or high blood pressure medication. Then there's fasting with food. Now, fasting with food sounds crazy. Like, how can you fast with food? But there is a center at USC called the Center of Study of Gerontology, which is a study of aging. And they came up with something called the fasting mimicking diet, which is basically for those people who are on my Zoom class now know that I've spent a great deal of time in the past talking about it, because I think it's one of the greatest things that is going to allow you to become metabolically flexible, in addition to a whole host of other benefits. And I'll be talking about that actually more in detail on Sunday, where we have a whole class dedicated to the fasting mimicking diet. But basically what it is it's a low calorie diet for 5 days. It's low animal protein, it's 0 animal protein, and very, very low sugar. It's a balance of around 1,100 calories the first day, and around 700 or 800 calories days 2 through day 5. It's 5 days. And the most remarkable thing about the fasting mimicking diet is that you mimic the effects of a 5-day water-only fast, but you still get to eat a little bit of food. Now, the reason that you are only eating essentially a vegan diet for these 5 days is because it activates animal protein, that is, activates something called nutrient sensing pathways. And when those are activated, the problem that you get into is that it basically gets rid of the effect of giving you the effect of fasting. So you do this for 5 days. And the most amazing thing is you do it once. The studies were basically done for 5 days a month, once a month for 3 months, and then every 3 to 4 months thereafter. And when you do that, the most remarkable thing is that the effects of your metabolic flexibility, that is your ability to switch into burning fat, lasts for 3 months thereafter. 3 full months. That's people going back to eating the way they were eating before. And at miraclenoodle.com, we actually have that available. If you go to our website and you type in the word Pareto, P-A-R-E-T-O, we actually have our own plan. It's basically 5 days of food. Comes with coaching with me. If you go to miraclenoodle.com, again, just type in P-A-R-E-T-O. And that's what we call the program, because the Pareto principle is a principle that says that 20% of the input yields 80% of the output, meaning that if you concentrate on, which is essentially around 20% of the month, getting this fasting program in, you get an effect that lasts essentially the entire month. So that's fasting with food. And of course, the next type of fasting that I didn't list here is extended water-only fasting. Now, the problem with water-only fasting is that there are people who do 30-day fasts. There are places that you can go to that will allow you to do this. The problem is that you lose muscle mass. It has to be medically supervised. And oddly enough, if you do like a 20 or 30-day fast, which obviously people are doing for major medical problems, you actually can tend to lose somewhat of the ability of your metabolic flexibility, because your body is just used to eating your own fat, so that when you go back and you start eating sugar, your blood sugar can spike, and it can take you a while for your body to sort of reach a balance. But just doing a 5-day fasting with food process, like we have on miraclenoodle.com, the most amazing thing happens is you get to eat, because Miracle Noodles have really no calories, you are able to feel full and still do this fast in a very, very easy fashion. So those are and the other thing is that when you're doing a fasting with food, you're not going to lose the muscle mass that you would normally lose if you were essentially doing a water-only fast, because you're getting nutrients. It allows you to preserve your muscle. And obviously we want to get rid of fat, We want to activate that, that lipolysis, the breaking down of fat. So there's that. Next is the cyclic ketogenic diet. So the reason that I put that in here is because what can happen with the ketogenic diet is that when you're on the ketogenic diet for a very, very long time, if you're just in ketosis forever, what happens is that when you challenge your body with a lot of carbs kicking you out of ketosis, if your body hasn't switched to going back and forth between burning sugar and burning fat, and you've been in ketosis, you've been in burning fat mode for a long, long period of time, then it's not uncommon for people to have blood sugar that actually spikes. And it just spikes, and it means that they're no longer metabolically flexible. Their body's adapted to just being in ketosis. And honestly, this is one of the things that I think make it intuitive to me that it is not natural for you to stay in ketosis for forever. Now, there are reasons to be in ketosis for forever, meaning, you know, there are people with seizure disorders. There are people who have metastatic cancer in some cases that need to stay in ketosis. I've met people who, if they go above 20 grams of carbs, their seizure disorder activates, and they need to stay in this incredibly low. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about people who are on the ketogenic diet for reasons of improved health or weight loss, whatever the case may be, other than sort of reversal of a major medical issue. So cyclic, meaning that you go in and out of ketosis, and this is going to allow you to maintain the metabolic flexibility and not get rid of the ability of your body to burn sugar. We want to be able to learn to burn, you want your body to be able to learn to burn both. And the next is a low protein, high nutrient dense diet. And when I talk about low protein, I'm talking about animal protein. Now, why animal protein? I mentioned it briefly around 15 minutes ago. The reason is because animal protein is one of those things that raises insulin levels. And when insulin levels are chronically high, then your ability for your body to break down fat is hindered. And that, for a lot of people, sounds, a lot of people don't actually understand that. The reason is, essentially, is because this enzyme called lipase, which breaks down fat, is basically inhibited by high insulin levels. And we don't realize, we think, a lot of people think of insulin and they think sugar, but a lot of people don't realize that animal protein, cheese as an example, makes your insulin level spike. So if we're talking about this delicate balance of this dance of metabolism between burning sugar and burning fat, and the more elegant, the easier your body switches, sort of the more elegant and the more healthy the dance between these two extremes, you are essentially healthier when you can do that. And for a lot of people who've been eating chronically poor for years and years and years, the issue is these chronically high insulin levels that are going to make a huge difference in, you know, your ability to get into that fat burning state. I'll just say one thing, that is, animal protein is one of those things that a lot of people, you know, it's one of those things that it raises like a lot of emotions in the world when people sort of, you know, they don't want to give up their meat. Now, I'm not saying you have to go vegan, but your choice of animal protein has to be a very reasoned choice. And what I mean by that is that the fact is that higher amounts of animal protein, the higher and higher amounts that you eat, it's really associated with a whole host of problems. And one of the reasons that is because when your insulin level is high, insulin is also, there's something called insulin-like growth factor, which also goes high. When that gets high, it's like a growth factor. I mean, insulin is sort of a growth factor, meaning this can lead to your body in sort of an active growth state. Now, if you're a bodybuilder, and your goal is, to put on as much muscle mass, then the animal protein is fine. What I'm talking about is your ability to be able to live a long life. That's my focus when I teach. I want you to live as long as possible and as healthy as possible. That's sort of the goal. There is a reason why bodybuilders in general do not live long lives. Now, they're obviously, Jack LaLanne, as an example, lived until his 90s, but he was also doing things like juicing a whole lot of vegetables every day. And he really, I think it was only egg white protein that he ate. And his diet, other than that, was just perfectly pristine. He was also taking mega doses of vitamins, but he maintained this incredible muscle mass. But I bet if when he was alive, you checked his insulin level, I bet it wouldn't be as high as some of these bodybuilders. So your choice of animal protein, I hope you make a reasoned choice behind that. There are people that, need a little bit more animal protein. As you get older, your body needs a little bit more protein. But I hope you think about that. I think that most of us, generally speaking, would do just fine with, if you don't want to be vegan, and a lot of people don't for obvious reasons, then you most of the time 20 grams, which is like 1 can of sardines, the size of your palm, when it comes to the size of the animal protein, is probably enough per day. Again, as you get older, if you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s, then more animal protein has actually been shown to not have any. Once you get past like 65, the studies at USC basically showed that after a certain age, like I think it was 65, the amount of animal protein that you ate generally didn't cause all that much trouble. I don't think it caused any trouble from what I remember. But before that, the increase in animal protein was associated with a whole host of things that decreased longevity, basically. So there's that. So let's talk a little bit about this low protein, and it really should say low animal protein, high nutrient dense diet. So there's essentially the whole foods plant-based diet, which is basically a vegan diet that is oil-free and just very nutrient dense. There's also something called the nutritarian diet by a doctor by the name of Joel Fuhrman. And this is essentially, again, a very nutrient dense greens, beans, nuts, seeds diet. It's very, very packed with nutrients. And this is generally a low calorie diet. So because of the amount of fiber that you're eating, you essentially can eat almost unlimited amounts you can eat almost unlimited amounts of vegetables, and you're not going to gain weight because of the space it takes up. You almost can't possibly get that much in. Those people are metabolically flexible, and their risk for things like type 2 diabetes is almost non-existent if they're avoiding processed carbohydrates and junk foods. And then there's calorie restriction. And I might add that the reason I mention diabetes is because of the fact that when your blood sugar is chronically going up, your body is going to develop insulin resistance. And when you're insulin resistant, that by definition essentially is that you're metabolically inflexible. And we'll get into that a little bit before we close the lecture tonight. Then there's calorie restriction. Now, there is an organization called the CR Way, and there are a bunch of people that eat a very low calorie diet. Again, I mentioned this earlier, for the purposes of longevity. Now, most of these people are very, very skinny. They're very, very cold because their metabolic rate drops a little bit. It's not something I recommend, but because they're essentially going into a fasted state, they do go into ketosis almost certainly, and then they eat and they probably go out of ketosis. So they're going in and out. not something I recommend. But they're also eating a nutrient-dense diet, but they actually do calorie restriction. It sounds kind of kooky, but I don't know how many people there are that do that, but there are a decent amount. Okay, exercise. So exercise is key to maintaining metabolic flexibility. It's something that I haven't mentioned in my previous classes about metabolic flexibility. But sort of the healthy transition from fasting to feeding, as we've discussed, involves shifts in basically fat metabolism to more sugar metabolism in muscle. And the primary purpose of that is to move from catabolic, which is basically a breaking down using the fuel, to an anabolic process where you're building up, in which energy can be stored in skeletal muscle, fat, and liver. So we spoke about glycogen as an example. It can be stored in muscle. It can be fat can be stored in fat, obviously, and glycogen can be stored in the liver. And insulin release after a meal is what causes this shift. So it's the food that is causing this shift. Now, with exercise, you're basically using your muscles, which are basically this prime metabolic shifter, mover of your body. And that is going to, as we spoke about earlier, break down glycogen. If we go up here to exercise, your body is going to use fatty acids. And thank you, Tikadi, for your comment, by the way. And if you have any questions, I think Funny Nurse is asking questions. So when we're talking about exercise, your body is basically going to increase the use of fatty acids by your mitochondria for energy. You're also going to get increased glycogen, decreased glycogen storage. Your body is using that. Increasing your lipolysis, because your body is going to need the fatty acids to use, and then decreased fatty acid storage, because again, you're using it. So you can see that being able to shift between sleep and fasting and exercise is essentially almost, if you just look at it from these aspects, your body is basically shifting back and forth between all these different things. That's what's maintaining your metabolic flexibility. Okay. So let's talk about, we're coming up on almost 45 minutes after the hour. And so we'll close tonight with talking about factors that affect metabolic flexibility. But we've actually covered most of them already, but we'll go through them briefly. So we spoke just a little bit about insulin resistance. And of course, we understand that there's lots of things that happen with insulin resistance, but basically most of us know that, you get these elevated levels of, when you get elevated levels of blood sugar, your body is trying its hardest to adapt essentially to this unnatural state. And essentially what happens is eventually your body just, you don't want to take it all into your cells, all this, because your body's trying to prevent that. So you get essentially, you get this insulin sensitivity. Your insulin levels go up, but they're not doing what they did before. So you're getting impaired use of fatty acids. In other words, your mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, are getting to be impaired, and you're getting buildup of fat that can happen actually inside the cell. There is some debate, though, whether insulin resistance in muscle is the primary defect in diabetes. Nonetheless, the point, this is probably a little bit too much, but the point is that there are essentially defects in fatty acid oxidation that happen. So your ability to break down fat, which is basically what we've spoken about when we're talking about metabolic inflexibility, but it's happening as a result of obesity and insulin sensitivity. With, as we said, we're getting lipid accumulation inside the cells, which is messing things up. And it's all been associated with insulin resistance, and of course, which is directly related to type 2 diabetes. And there's some debate that continues as to which organ or tissue is causing this, whether it's muscle or not. But the point is that we do need to be careful, and we do need to exercise. Circadian variation is going to impair your ability to be metabolically flexible, meaning if you are not respecting your circadian rhythms, then it's going to, we've known for years that just one night of poor sleep affects glucose metabolism, affects your blood sugar for up to 48 hours. And I think now that we went through what happens during all those different cycles, we can sort of intuitively understand why that is. So with not respecting circadian variation, circadian rhythms, you're not going to be able to enter these stages in that case. Sloppy4 is asking, does ketone supplements, taking ketone supplements boost fat burn? It depends on the state that you're actually in. Your body can use ketones supplements for energy, especially if it's in the right state, but it doesn't necessarily boost fat burn unless the rest of your body is in the right state. Hope that answers your question. And the state, of course, that we're talking about is what we've sort of been speaking here. Then there's a signaling system in your body called AMPK, and it's sort of known as the master switch. And there are many things that impact this. This is essentially your ability to, it is a marker of metabolic flexibility to be able to activate AMPK. And there are several things that can do that. So amazingly, metformin, which is a medicine a lot of us have heard of for type 2 diabetes, is one of the ways it works is activating AMPK. And people who activate AMPK tend to actually live a longer time. It's also associated with lowering of something called mTOR, which is something that goes up with animal protein and goes up with sugar as well. But it's something that when you have high levels of this mTOR, your body can build a whole lot of muscle. But it's also the same thing that we spoke about before, which is you can have too much. If you have too much of it, too much animal protein, too much of this mTOR activation, you're actually going to have a lot of factors that are going to decrease your longevity. Berberine, which is a supplement, exercise and fasting, and something called Gynostema tea, which is something that I drink. There's one company called, blanking on the name, but you can find Gynostema tea. It's actually quite tasty. That can help activate AMPK as well. Okay, so let's review a little bit about what we spoke about tonight. And let me zoom out here just a little bit on the screen. So many of you who listen weekly to my class, we went into a lot more detail than we normally do. We have spoken about metabolic flexibility in previous classes. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail here. I think the biggest things that I would like for you to take away from this is that having the acknowledgement that there are two forms. You can think of it in two ways, meaning burning sugar and burning fat. That's one takeaway. And the second takeaway is that these are all of the things that are happening in those two spaces, whether it's laying down fat or burning glycogen. All of these things have a unique place in your body. Just looking for questions here. And I would say that again, getting back to the things that I want you to take away from this is that you need to respect, metabolically speaking, what's going on in all of these different states: sleep, fasting, exercise, and eating, and how each needs to, you need to dedicate yourself to maintaining this sort of distinct thing going on. One is we should all be incorporating some kind of fasting. As we spoke about, the easiest one for you to do is called time restricted feeding. Just get that 13 hours in, try to get it to 14 and 15, and then you are golden. Sleep. Well, make sure you're not eating right before you go to sleep, which sort of kicks into the fact of time restricted feeding. Respect the fact that your body should be calming down, and there should be a process before you're going to sleep where your body is relaxing, your parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxing part of your nervous system is starting to be activated. Unfortunately, in the modern era, we are having this overlapping of these things that are going on, and it's not respecting the natural rhythms of the body. And then we need to get into exercising. K-Tazi64 is asking, what is the best time for time restricted feeding? The best time is to count from your dinner to your breakfast. So as you may have come on afterwards, but basically you want to get 13 hours. And when you get 13 hours, you get activation of a lot of positive health benefits. So if you finish your dinner at 7 o'clock, then you don't eat breakfast until 8 a.m. the next morning. That's 13 hours. And then you could try to go 1 hour before and then 1 hour after, meaning 1 hour later for breakfast and 1 hour earlier for dinner. So a funny nurse is saying she eats late at night, so that's a problem. It is and it isn't. I mean, if you eat late at night, then you just need to delay your breakfast, or maybe even not eat breakfast and just push out your breakfast a couple hours later. I would suggest for you that if you're eating late at night, then you come up with a ritual of sorts for when you go to sleep. In other words, maybe it's a relaxing bath, or maybe your significant other gives you a massage, something that shifts your body into this state of being able to shift into this getting ready for sleep. So she's saying she eats at 11 p.m. So again, it's okay. That would mean that for 13 hours later, right, it's going to be noon the next day to get that 13 hours in. And I think that's doable for a lot of people. You just have to work it through with your lifestyle. I'm getting another question here on can extreme dieting affect your metabolic flexibility or create metabolic resistance? Okay, so let's break that question down, and there are a few other questions here as well. Okay, so can extreme dieting affect your metabolic flexibility? Yes, it can. So let's take the example of very low calorie diets. People who are eating 700 calories a day. There's a 1200 calorie a day diet, and there's a whole host of these very low calorie diets, VLCDs they call them. It depends how your body reacts to those, but let's just keep in mind that it's not so much metabolic flexibility, but metabolic damage that can happen. In other words, your ability to just process calories gets down regulated, meaning when you start eating again, you can put on a whole lot more calories than you did before, because your body is adapting to this low calorie state. Now, keep in mind that I spoke about these people who are on calorie restriction. Now, the difference between calorie restriction and people who are on very low calorie diets is often the fact that people who do calorie restriction diets for longevity are eating an enormous number of nutrients. And this, in a lot of ways, protects people from the problems that can happen when they're just counting calories. So it's not as much an issue of metabolic resistance or metabolic flexibility as much of what's happening to your ability to handle the calories that you're getting. Sheila is asking, just looking at different questions. Sheila's asking, how does stress affect metabolic flexibility? Not physical stress, day-to-day stress. The biggest thing that I always tell people is, again, it's you want to be able to shift into these cycles properly. And if your stress is activating what's called the sympathetic nervous system, meaning your body is in that sort of fight or flight mode when you are chronically stressed. With that comes several things. I mentioned this, I believe, 2 weeks ago on my class, and that is that initially, just thinking about it from an appetite perspective, initially when you are stressed, initially your appetite actually goes down. If you're being chased by a lion, as an example, then your body doesn't want to eat. But with chronic stress, unfortunately, what happens with chronic stress is your body starts to adapt by elevating cortisol, which is going to increase your appetite, which is going to make you eat at times when you shouldn't be eating, which is going to affect what we've been speaking about tonight. On top of that, unfortunately, when the cortisol levels are high, then when you eat carbohydrates, high things that spike your blood sugar, it actually makes you feel calmer. It lowers your cortisol, but you're eating something that that is not good for your long-term health, unfortunately. So what's going on in that particular situation is you're putting your body into a state that can be medicated by foods that's going to cause you to gain weight. And this is sort of a secondary problem that happens with stress. Not to mention the fact that you can have trouble falling asleep, which is going to affect these cycles, which is going to directly affect your ability to have metabolic flexibility. So there's that. Sloppy4 is asking, is there an hour limit where intermittent fasting becomes harmful or pointless? Well, if we're talking about time-restricted feeding, which is what most people say is an intermittent fast, there's a few things to say. First of all, there are many people who are on 1 meal a day diets, and most of those people do just fine once they adapt to that. The problem sometimes is you end up eating so many calories, a full day's calories in one meal, that sometimes I wonder if you're not digesting things fully. So there's that. The second caution is if someone has a history of gallbladder issues, then you can have problems with your gallbladder if you're only eating 1 meal a day. So if you do have problems with gallbladder, and you want to do intermittent fasting, start at 13 hours and don't go crazy with that right off the bat. I hope that answers your question. Cheryl is asking, what's a healthy calorie amount per day? It really depends on your activity level, and your weight. The easiest thing that I recommend for everyone is to go to a website called Cronometer, 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 and you can get a free account, put in your activity level, your height, your weight, and it'll tell you, based on your goals, if you want to lose half a pound a week or you want to lose, more than that, and it'll tell you generally speaking, what the amount of calories roughly you should be eating per day. And that's really honestly, using a tracking software that has some of these calculators in it is really going to be helpful. So there's that. Steve is asking, what about my liver? I drink 1.75 of vodka every 5 days. I don't know, 1.75 what of vodka every 5 days? Probably, everyone's liver responds to alcohol differently. If you're drinking a lot of alcohol, I mean, a little bit of alcohol is probably not going to be that bad. And so All right, so let's move on to some other questions here. 1.75 liters of vodka every 5 days. Okay, all right. All right, so one of the questions I'm getting here is, Linda's asking about medications that suppress a person's natural metabolism, example, steroids. Based on what we've learned tonight, what do these medications do to this process that steps on the metabolism? Steroids are going to elevate your blood sugar, and they are going to affect your metabolism. It depends on the dose. You know, there are many people who are on low doses of steroids, systemic steroids like prednisone. And if you get everything else right, I've seen many people who are very, very healthy and are able to, you know, have, you know, no one's measuring their metabolic flexibility, but steroids have an impact. There's no doubt about that. So, yeah, what can I say? Donna's asking, how many hours after eating should you go to sleep to optimize the fasting state? I've also heard that the ideal time to sleep is between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. It's hard to say. I always believe everyone should have some kind of, as I mentioned, a ritual of getting into that state before going to sleep, to facilitate sleep and to facilitate that change that we went into when we were talking about shifting into those unique things that happen when you're asleep. And Ryan's asking where he can find a glycemic load chart. Just Google it. There's definitely many out there. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your attention tonight. For the people that are on Instagram who came on, my name is Dr. Carp. I'm president and founder of Miracle Noodle, and I'll be holding these classes once a week. I usually do. We have it on Zoom for some people, and then we'll also do it on Instagram as well. And I hope that you got a lot out of this. I enjoy doing this. Karen, you can reach out to me directly about that, and I'd be happy to talk to you. And that's all. I mean, as I always say, I'm grateful for all of you who are staying on the Zoom channel. Looks like everyone has stayed on. I wanted to thank you all for your attention, and I hope you got a lot out of this. Just say thank you, Dwight. You always have something nice to say. I appreciate your comments. Alana and Cheryl, Christopher, Donna, Doreen, Dwight, Ellie, Grant, Karen, Lewis, Linda, Loretta, Marcia, Mary. Ah, Mary, nice to see you, Mary. Hope everything's well in California. Ryan and Sheila and some others here as well. Thank you, Sloppy4, for your comments. And great, I would love it if you would join. And if you're interested in joining the Zoom call, just send a note to us on Instagram, and we'll send you the link so you can see the chart that I used during the class. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Again, my name is Dr. Carp, and I'll see you every week, every Wednesday night. I really enjoy doing this. I really appreciate it. Oh, and someone is asking about Lucy. Now, Lucy is my dog. She's right here. She's been very quiet tonight, but this is Lucy. She's very sleepy, I think. But she's been very, very quiet tonight. So someone was asking someone asked last week to have her more on, but I forgot because we got so carried away. But it looks like Lucy is very, very sleepy. So thank you all so much for your attention. Wish everyone a good night and a good evening, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.